And so welcome everyone to our to the first session, Beyond the Body, Beyond the Skin. So I'm going to just introduce George Life, who's going to kick everything off. George, do you need access? Are you going to be sharing slides?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so I'm just going to open up the security then to, everyone can share their screen, so that's fantastic. Let me just do a brief introduction. George Life is a poet, translator, scholar, currently competing a PhD in English at the University of Buffalo, SUNY. His dissertation examines the relationship between neologism and the US national identity in contemporary experimental writing. Other work includes 3 interrelated creative manuscripts concerned with matters of race, ecology, and genealogy, a mixed genre translation project based on selected couplets from the late poems of Dufour. Excerpts from these works appear most recently in Hambone, Data Bleed, and Circumference. A review of Edgar Garcia's Signs of the Americas, a Poetics of Pictography, Hieroglyphs, and Kupus are forthcoming from in Jacket 2. Take it away.
Thank you, Orchid. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you also, Matthew, and everyone, as Orchid said, for allowing us to do this remotely. And see, I just uploaded my paper. If anyone wants to, if anyone needs to read that or wants to read along with it, if that would be preferable. Also, in terms of citations, it's easier to see them there. So I'm going to share my screen. It should take about 19 minutes, hopefully just under 20. And I'm going to be playing one 8-minute clip, so I hope that is going to be audible. I also have an MP3 file of it, so if for any reason y'all can't hear that, I can share that as well. Let's see. Let's see, I don't see a button for sharing my screen. Oh, yes, sorry. There it is right in front of me. See, just a moment. Is that visible?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. So my paper is titled The Girl's Claim on the Present, Critical Fabulation in Kamau Brathwaite's Namsetoura. Critical fabulation is a term coined by Saidiya Hartman that names a method of applying imaginative pressure to the absence of Black girls' lives in the archive of the transatlantic slave trade. This methodological reflection is prompted by her own perceived failure in accounting for one girl known in the archive as Venus, who died aboard a slave ship. There exists no textual record of her, yet the reference to her exerts what Hartman calls a claim on the present. She explains, wrestling with the girl's claim on the present is a way of naming our time, thinking our present, and envisioning the past which has created it. So in this paper, I'll be talking about the figure of Namsetoura, which appears in the work of Barbadian poet and historian Kamau Brathwaite, as an instance of what Hartman calls critical fabulation. So according to Brathwaite himself, Namsetoura is the spirit of an enslaved African girl who died in Barbados, perhaps at the turn of the 18th century. In response to an encounter with her, Brathwaite wrote and published a poem in multiple versions, 9 by my count, from 2000 to 2005, presented in different formats containing a range of documents and commentary. Reading Brathwaite's engagement in light of Hartman's clarifies, for me at least, how critical fabulation functions as an African diasporic practice of speculative genealogy. Both Brathwaite and Hartman are historians. Both are devoted, in Hartman's words, to, quote, performing the limits of writing history. While Hartman pursues such performance through narrative, Brathwaite does so through poetry. What I'm interested in here is how he does so at the level of the word. Before going on, I just want to say a little bit about my interest in this work. As part of a broader research I'm conducting, as referenced in my bio, on the interrelations between race, capitalism, and ecology, just recently taken a turn into genealogical territory. In particular, it's related to a mixed genre project involving my own genealogical ties to the English settlement of Virginia. And more immediately, it informs research I'm now conducting with my partner on the history of land where we're now living in central Missouri, which is the site of a former plantation and contains one of the few slave cabins remaining in the state. So all of these projects are interrelated, whether critical, creative, personal, or whatever it might be. So a little bit about context. So Brathwaite's engagement with Namsetoura, like Hartman's engagement with Venus, can be situated in a broader premillennial obsession in art and theory with ghosts and haunting. Some date the origins of what some call the spectral turn to the publication of Derrida's Spectres of Marx in 1994. In the field of Black studies, this orientation is manifested in work concerned with what Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery. In a recent study, Stephen Best points to Toni Morrison's Beloved as the source of much work that he rather disparagingly calls melancholic historicism. Even more recently, Ginny Sharp counters Best by suggesting that we shift our focus away from the established frameworks of Derridian spectrality and Freudian melancholia. Instead, she reads the work of poets and artists for the methodologies internal to them, conceptualizing what she calls an African diaspora poetics of loss. So my own approach aligns with Sharp's. The first chapter of her book focuses on Imnobese Philip Zong, undoubtedly the parallel in poetry to Morrison's Beloved in fiction, while her last chapter treats Brathwaite. Sharp's really very fabulous study zeroes in on Brathwaite's dream stories, emphasizing elements of personal and literary narrative. She touches rather briefly on Namsetoura in that respect. In terms of Brathwaite's practice of the word, which is what I'm interested in, I want to draw attention to what he calls language, or the language of the land. If I don't know the language, what right have I then to be claiming kith and kin? He writes in one version of the Namsetoura text. In other words, Brathwaite's practice of speculative genealogy is aimed at accessing ancestral language, native, or he would say nativized or indigenized to the land. Important for my purpose is the fact that the word language is a neologism, the product of a collision of words and a tectonic submergence of one consonant under another. Its morphological dynamics are at once linguistic, geological, and psychological, speaking to what Brathwaite calls this geopsychic fragmentation of the Caribbean. I'm gonna play an 8-minute clip of Brathwaite reading the Namsetoura poem. So for some historical and geographical context, this is Barbados, where he lives and where the land where he encountered Namsetoura is located in southern Barbados. So this encounter occurred on a parcel of land that he bought in the 1990s on the southern coast, which I've circled there at the bottom. On that land, he intended to live out his life, essentially to retire very purposefully on that land, assembling his personal archive and building a public cultural center. The Barbadian government had other plans, however. It wanted the land to expand a nearby airport. While documenting the land before having to abandon it, Brathwaite he was doing a kind of photographic inventory of it. And one thing he was trying to take a picture of was a spider web. So while he was trying to do this, 2 cameras broke before he was able to get a few pictures of it with his wife's old Kodak camera. So one of the resulting pictures was the one shown here, which Brathwaite identifies as Namsetoura. Although for Hartman, quote, dead girls can't speak, unquote, for Brathwaite, apparently they can, or at least Namsetoura does. Conveyed, certainly performed, possibly created by Brathwaite in collaboration with forces other than himself, or to which he bears some kind of strange resemblance. His Brathwaite's intention, as Hartman says, hers is not to give, quote, not to give voice to the slave, but rather to imagine what cannot be verified, unquote. Okay, so here's the text. This is one presentation of the Namsetoura poem. So I'm going to show the pages from the book while playing the recording of Brathwaite reading it. I'll just identify it first. So the first part of the poem, I should say, is in Brathwaite's voice, and then he transitions into Namsetoura's voice, who essentially like takes over the poem. And I'm going to play that part, the second part, where Namsetoura speaks. So as far as I'm aware, it's the only recording of him reading it, which is, to me, just remarkably valuable. He died in 2020, just before the pandemic began. So it appears on the radio program Cross Cultural Poetics, hosted by Leonard Schwartz. And characteristically, Brathwaite adds a great deal of commentary interspersed with his reading of it. So please let me know if you can't hear this, or if it's not clear, then I could just share the file. Y'all hear that?
No.
No, okay, let me see if I can. Can y'all hear that?
No, we can't. You need to play it
Okay.
through the sound system. You're currently running the sound through your headphones.
Orchid, can you direct him a little bit more?
Yeah, if you go to sort of, I'm not entirely too sure because I can't see it on your screen, but if you go to perhaps through preferences and actually play it through the audio, there should be an audio function.
Okay.
George, can you send the file to Orchid?
I mean, I can.
So y'all don't hear that? I'll just share the file, then y'all could listen to it. I've trimmed it so it's exactly the 8 minutes that I want y'all to hear. Let me see.
If you put it in the chat, maybe Orchid can play it.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
I mean, we're doing fine. We're not in a super rush here.
Yeah, here's some attaching it in the chat.
I don't see it in the chat.
I think it's loading. It's like
Oh.
11 megabytes now.
There it is.
There we go. Okay.
And yet you tell me this, you tell me this. And then she describes a 9-night ceremony, because when Africans and other people too, I'm sure, are before they are buried, and after they're buried, there's the whole ceremony about internment, and then the observation of the travel of the spirit to the underworld and to some kind of resting place. And in our society, we call it 9 nights. And she says, no calabash or flower on my mound, no 9-night wake, no 40 days of journey through the salt lagoon, no fruit to heal this lips, no okra at my hips. What happened here to me is like you vomit up a rodent in Kaneshi market, and Kaneshi is the great market of Accra. 300 years of staring here under this spider web and bush, and Nancy at my door of herbs. And now you come disturb me with your camera, destroy the ruin of my spiral with your flash. Oh, wash me now, my child, my nephew, flesh, great-great-grandeur from this other world. You think they're dispossessing you? You think you tall? You think you Masakura Rasta Buanergy man? Reckon you rave? You say you writing poem Kimber about slave? You ever hear what Grandy Nanny tell the Bakra man about she black backside? But look at you, Donna. Look what become of you. Marasmi, Bakra, Brony, half white, backside boy. Eating the Bakra culture, the Bakra backside culture, eating you. And that's another phenomenon of this poem, because usually, as you know, the oracle, when the oracle speaks, the oracle usually speaks in very intoned and refined language. And here is this woman speaking to me in basic 4-letter words, and in other words, abusing me for being what I pretending to be. The marasme is a thing that when you suffer from malnutrition, you are called a marasma baby. So she calls me a marasme bakra brony, half white, backside boy. And brony is what the West Africans call a white man. So she's saying that your culture, the acquisition of your culture, the tonality of your culture, despite what you talk about nation language, is still not, as far as she's concerned, authentic. And I'm eating the Bakra culture, Bakra being the white man, the slave owner's culture, and the Bakra backside culture eating you. And then she says, Jab Piwa, and that is in large type on the page. Jab Piwa. And then she laughs at me since I don't understand what that means. Say what? The man you say is man you say don't understand. Too many crystals in your engine. Your brain like windmills spinning without cane or agency. The cat whip cut your tongue. Write this in flash before the new red season come. Don't write it down in coral, that is water that will spill. Write it inside my full body, berry, burning coal. And then she says it again with a variation. Je, nyami, bidwa. Je, nyami, bidwa. Je, nyami, bidwa. Je, and she begins a little translation. Je, only under God the fire, but only from my bosom tra. The Je Nami is actually one of the great Akan symbols from the Adinkra cloths of mourning. And the Je Nami is a symbol that means only under God, as she says. What is interesting is that I had been given one of these lovely golden icons when I was leaving Ghana after I was there for 10 years. I was given this by one of the elders in the village where I lived, and he said that I should keep this for my safety and my progress onwards in the world. And that icon was stolen from me at Yale. Well, I lost it when I was at Yale University in 1986.
Oh my, of all places.
And I think that clearly she is referring to the loss of this promise that I had said I would keep. So the J Nyami Bidwa. Now, but the Bidwa is the opposite of Nyami means God, and Bidwa is the opposite of God. So what she's done there is she's condensed only under God with the opposite of God. And she therefore creates a roadblock of a contradiction in my ears, which she then carries further with her saying, but only from my bosom tra. You think I sick, you think I slack, you know a bosom tra, what call it so? Tell me why big snout long, why rat a living hole, why nasty dog eat dirty pudding? What is the cockroach foliage situation? J, only the redemption of my bosom tra, me tell you. And the children this year wound, me say. The liberation. But it took me a long time to realize what she meant by bosom tra. Bosom Tree is the sacred lake of the Akan people, and I had been there, a very rare thing to be allowed the privilege of visiting Lake Bosom Tree. But she does not say Bosom Tree, she says Bosom Tra, which Bosom means sacred, and the sacred lake is called Bosom Tree, the sacred lake of the tree-speaking people. But Tra means vagina. So again, she's condensed and contradicted in a single statement two very different worlds and condensed them into what we can only call a Creole statement, a statement of agony and conflict between the world of the slave master and the world of the slave. And she says it is only if you understand the connection between yourself and my genitals, in other words, the generational connection between myself and you, that we will ever have, or you will ever have, liberation.
Palmer Park by the children's play area, July.
Okay, can y'all hear me again? Yes, okay, great. Okay, back. So I spent a lot of time trying to understand this poem, despite the resonance of the photograph of Namsetoura, which is obviously striking. For me, it's the neologisms that are crucial to her claim on the present. Brathwaite posits elsewhere in a text written, I'm pretty sure at about the same time, that, quote, all art in its varying degrees is a response to pyrexia, to the temperature of the unnormal. The more severe the fever / the crisis / the culture crisis / the world quake, the more extreme the artistic response. Namsetoura's neologisms are manifestly extreme, bespeaking that temperature of the unnormal, conveying intense pressure both to communicate and to conceal. The graph shown here is one way that I've tried to understand the core neologism in the poem, which Brathwaite talks at length about, Gya Nyame Bitawa. Specifically, the second of his two elements, Gya Bitawa, which in a country means coal or charcoal. What I want to draw attention to in this feverish complex of word associations that I've tried to map out here is the issue of mapping them, of trying to represent them. in some recognizable form. The format that I've presented here and really defaulted to is, of course, the family tree. So while making it, I had in mind passages in Brathwaite's work where he conceptualizes phonemes and other bits of language in terms of DNA or quote unquote cultural genes. Yet the family tree model is clearly misleading, is too logical, is too linear. It doesn't capture the hallucinatory layering of Brathwaite and Namsetoura, fact and fiction, affective release and critical reflection. It doesn't register the disorienting experience of reading the 9 some odd published versions of the poem, you know, if one can actually like locate them, across which Brathwaite replaced this encounter over and over, shifting the format, adding supplementary documents, devising further commentary. The tree model is simply our naturalized container for genealogy. And last slide. So the alphabet no longer running A to Z. That is one way that Brathwaite describes the diasporic African experience of language, or at least alphabetic language. The alphabet no longer running A to Z. Brathwaite refers to Namsetoura as his sister, his mother, his aunt. At the same time, he claims that she occupies a state of, quote, interthreshold gender, prior to the binary differentiation of the sexes. For her part, Namsetoura calls Brathwaite her child, as well as her great-great-grandbrother. Great-great-grandbrother, as shown in this passage here from the poem, the first part of the poem that I didn't play, which reads, "Oh, wash me now, my child, my metaphor, flesh of my flesh, great-great-grandbrother from this other world." Brathwaite stages himself as metaphor, posits himself as ancestor, confounding the line between that familiar world there and this other one here. So here's a confounding of generation, as well as to some extent, a lesser extent, gender, recalling Hortense Spiller's discussion of what she calls the confusions of consanguinity resulting from the transatlantic slave trade. So what I've tried to show in this paper is how Brathwaite not only registers that confusion, but uses it, raises it to a feverish pitch for purposes of speculative genealogy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, George. That was really wonderful. I'm really fascinated by this idea of language and how one might sort of read or write the landscape through nation language, and maybe you can sort of touch more upon that during our Q&A. I'm going to push over to move down to Dr. Quadri, who is a postdoctoral fellow with the NRF DST, South African Research Chairs Initiative in Geopolitics and the Arts of Africa and Global South Research Program, Fine Art Department at Rhodes University. He studied visual arts at the University of Lagos, Nigeria, to a PhD level, and he has worked with the Creative Arts Department and School of Foundation Studies, both in the University of Lagos. He was a research assistant on the AHRC-funded research project, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but ArtPs, the visual articulations of politics in Nigeria, hosted by the Bournemouth University in the United Kingdom. And he has participated in workshop, conference, and symposiums in Nigeria and diaspora. He has published in local and international journals, and his research focuses on Artivism, protest art and performance, art ecology, and the intertwining narratives of space and place, indigenous knowledge production, decolonization of African art pedagogy and historical narratives, African Yoruba literature, semiotics, and the iconography interpretation of pottery, image, and tradition. Dr. Quadri.
Dr. Quadri, we are ready for your presentation.
I've just sent a message.
Can you hear me now?
Hello, you're on.
Okay, all right. Good day, everyone.
Good day.
Happy to be here, and it's a privilege to be able to participate in this year's conference of Newsview. And this evening, I will be presenting a topic: activism, visual imagery, and police brutality in Africa. Before I go ahead, I want to share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So the topic before me this afternoon here is activism, visual imagery, and police brutality in Africa, a nexus between the culture of torture and torment. There's the proverbial and didactic statement which says, "He who lives in glass house should not throw stone," addresses the cognitive and mental flaw of police excesses in Africa, who decorate themselves as beasts of no nation. We live in such a complex time where the fundamental human rights of the masses and the values placed on human lives are complicated and fluid. Unbearable brutality is becoming a global phenomenon, especially in Africa, from the west to the east, from the north to the central, and from the central to southern Africa, under the subjection of the security forces who are supposed to secure the nation, but kept plundering it. Several measures have been introduced by Africans to criticize and question disrespect to human values, oppression, apathy, pains, sufferings, callousness, atrocity, political subjugation, unbearable government agenda, hopeless situation, and infringement on the fundamental human rights of the people. This paper focuses on activism as a visual representation of engaging police brutality, exposing the culture of human torture and torment as portrayed by Lemi Garioku in Fela Anikulapo Kuti's CD covers painting, which include Halagmo Close, Kalakuta Show, Zombie, Sorrow, Tears, and Blood, and The Beast of No Nation. The research objectives are to interrogate how the visual imagery on the CD covers of Fela Anikulapo Kuti project the culture of torment and culture in Africa, and also to discuss how the painting trajectory of Lemi Garioku resonates the lyrics of Fela Anikulapo Kuti on police brutality. The study is also guided by two research questions. How does the visual imagery on the CD covers of Fela Anikulapo Kuti project the culture of torment and culture in Africa? And how does the painting trajectory of Lemi Garioku resonate with the lyrics of Fela Anikulapo Kuti on police brutality as portrayed by the artist? The methodology that is adopted for this study is formalism, and which is embedded in qualitative and descriptive analysis of polysemous visual representation, rooted within connotative meaning, engaged to interrogate socio-political contestation in Africa. Engaging the use of visual imagery on CD covers as a channel of disengagement from other artistic theory to communicate topical issues of communal intervention. Activism is engaged as metaphoric, iconic, and symbolic construct within a socio-political context for political communication. For this study, purposive sampling technique is adopted in the selection of visual imagery that is analyzed within the criteria of selection being in the context of socio-political themes. Understanding activism in Africa. Activism is a coinage of art and activism. I mean, the chemistry of word formation of putting art and activism together. And activism is becoming a global contestation in African space, where artists use genres of art as a weapon to address injustice and socio-political contestation within the society. Activism is a word that is used to describe the essence of art in a non-violent campaign for the fundamental human rights of the people. The struggle for accessible and democratic society across the world, specifically in Africa, with the benefit of agitating for essential resources and life support materials are the cravings of activists for the benefit of Africans. Having this in mind, the activities of the activists, especially an artist-oriented, participatory and inclusive democracy, as dividend for the citizen through the lenses of art. Scholars such as Manbridge, 1990, Naples, 1992, Ryan, 1992, and other scholars have expatiated the issues of political action, activism, social problems, and the need to direct quality effort towards this contestation. Vecchi in 2010 defined activism as involving local instigation of new series of elements intersecting the actual generating new collective enunciation and experimentations and investigation, which erode good and common sense and cause structure to swing away from their sedimented identities. The concept of police brutality. What is brutality? In a simple form, brutality is the use of unnecessary or excessive force by police officers when handling civilians. This is characterized by the use of substances like nerve gas or beatings, though it may not have to be physical abuse or attack. And in the other word, we can also look at it as the excessive and unwarranted use of force by law enforcement agency against the civilian. It is an extreme form of police misconduct or violence and is a civil rights violation. And it also refers to a situation where officers exercise undue or excessive force against a person. Police violence includes, but is not limited to physical or verbal harassment, emotional, mental injury, property damage, inaction of police officer, and in some cases, this may also lead to death. The conversation on police brutality has gained public attention in recent time in Africa. In a democratic state, the fundamental human right of citizens cannot be contested if such states crave for peaceful coexistence. From the case study of Nigeria and South Africa, in August 26, 2020 and October 2020, protesters clustered around the streets at the El Dorado Park in Johannesburg and Cotton, and also in Lekki Toll Gate in Lagos, respectively, agitating for police reform. Agitating for police reform against brutality. The vociferation emanated due to the death of a teenage boy, 16 years of age, and with a Down syndrome individual who was shot dead by police officers after becoming disgusted with his response towards the questions that were posted to him by police officers in South Africa. And also the peaceful protest that was staged in Nigeria in October 2020, where the youths were fired, and which resulted into the death of some of these youth, and this brought about the lingered anger over police excesses and accusation of illicit torture, harassment, unjustified arrest, shootings, rape, extortion, among other incriminating offenses that have been leveled against the SARS, which is a Nigerian police unit, and SAPS officers in South Africa. So without proactive action taken by the government to permanently curtail these abnormalities spreading like inferno, the protests ballooned into wider grievances against the government, with agitation for a total reform by the police. So all scholars like Big, Jan, and Goffert Micro in 2013 argued that police officers and gendarmes occasionally beat civilians to assert their authority. They torture suspects to get information, or shoot dead armed robbers to deliver immediate justice. They are supposed to act as the violence specialists of the state, yet their use of violence is highly controversial. Civilians often fight back when they encounter police, but otherwise demand even harsher method from the police, and they tend to face the civilian to curtail them. In addition to this, the NGOs also complain about police brutality, and this resonates with the provocations of Afrobeat minstrel Fela Anikulapo Kuti, who used his lyrics to expose the use of maladministration, police brutality, embezzlement, misappropriation of public funds, unconstitutional power abuse, governmental torment using police and soldiers since 1976. Since 1976. Police force is also known with preventing crime in the society. Groen and Pig in Chukwu et al. Advanced that the police institution is created to provide the requisite enabling environment for civilians to live and work towards social, economic, and political development of the society. Citizens' right to fair hearing and access to the rulings of the constitutional benefit is becoming a mirage due to the ferocious deeds of the police. Since the advent of democracy in Nigeria and after the apartheid era in South Africa, the police vicious and hostile attitude towards the members of the public has resulted into loss of lives and property, dehumanization, breakdown of law and order, massive corruption, socio-political ills, and economic crisis in the countries under discourse. Going by their unrepented disposition, the sight of the police officers anywhere, irrespective of the circumstances, send fears down the spine of people as arbitrary arrest, unlawful detention, and other forms of threats, until family members negotiate payment for the release of their loved one that are being arrested. Now the works hinge on the CD covers which were produced by Lemi Garioku, as I've said earlier on, who was the one that took it upon himself to design the CD covers of Fela Anikulapo Kuti. So in the course of this, he was able to design 26 of the CD cover of Fela Anikulapo Kuti. So in this study, I will be focusing on five selected ones within the theme of social-political discourse. Now, the first one is Alagbo Close. Alagbo Close is a visual imagery which got its name from the street of the police headquarters where Fela was imprisoned. And when Fela was imprisoned, the imprisonment experience which Fela had brought about the musical composition, the musical production, which he termed Alagbon Close. This artwork was the first compact disc painting commission produced by Lemi Garioku using oil on board with a collage approach depicting Fela's experience at the Alagbon Maximum Prison in Lagos. And Lemi Garioku depicted Fela Anikulapo in chains under the terrible dehumanizing experience in the prison. Fela's community called Kalakuta was plundered with several levels of brutality that was melted upon him, and skull injury was also inflicted upon him. And after the prison experience of Fela Anikulapo, in the attempt to lapon the police, he came up with this musical production, which he called Alagbon Close. And it was from this musical production, which Fela Anikulapo has produced, that Lemi Garioku was given a commission to produce a CD jacket to be able to give a visual narrative of his Fela's experience when he was in the prison at the Alagbon Close, which is the maximum prison in Lagos. So the visual imagery that was depicted on the CD, it was a parody to criticize the existing political and social status quo, which was seen within the community and under the government of the day. So Lemi, which is the artist, employed the artistic approach of creating alternative reality in an attempt to resonate with the trauma that Fela was subjected to. When he was in the prison, he was subjected to brutality, torture, emotional torment, with which the police inflicted on him using their baiting and other ammunition which was in their custody around this particular period. So in this work of art, Lemi Garioku was trying to paint a scenario which is tantamount to a colonial experience in a post-colonial period. The painting pictures a sense of detachment from a peaceful ambience existing in Fela's Aden through the inflictment of pain and agony rooted in subjective defense. Fela's agitation and campaign for an ideal society was toppled by the torment of the police brutality. Alagbon Close, which was captured in this CD from interview with the artist, Alagbon Close was depicted as a jail pit of hell and anguish where prisoners suffered untold pain. Despite the torture and dehumanizing attempt to measure on Fela Anikulapo Kuti, his Kalakuta Republic stand on a rocky and firm foundation which could not be broken as at the particular time that the CD jacket was produced. So let me further satirize the policy of capturing Fela as a triumphant personality who has broken the chains and danced over a capsized police patrol boat. The image 2, which is tagged Kalakuta Show. Kalakuta Show is a simplistic narrative which is tagged the image 2, Kalakuta Show, illustrating the attack waged against Kalakuta Republic as depicted in the song of Fela. The painting describes how the police brutalized Fela with beating, guns, and axes to inflict pain on him and massive destruction on his Kalakuta Republic. On his Kalakuta Republic. Let me also address the legal contribution of Komi Osobu, who happened to be a human rights lawyer who was fighting for the release of Fela Anikulapo when Fela Anikulapo was being arrested and was imprisoned from time to time. In his painting, it was able to depict the contribution of this human rights lawyer and is the step in which he took towards making sure that Fela Anikulapo and those who were arrested at this particular period were released as at when due. Looking at the image, it shows the huge number of police that were discharged into the Kalakuta Republic to turn things upside down. And that is what Lemi has been able to capture in this painting. John Collins also gave his own account of the conversation he had with Fela Anikulapo in 1985. On how Fela Anikulapo was able to come up with the name Kalakuta. And further, after the release of Fela, when he left the prison, he had a discovery when he traveled to the East Africa. And that was when he discovered that the name that he adopted, which he now gave to his own haven where he was living, is a name that has its origin from the East Africa. In Swahili language, Kalakuta means rascal. And Fela Anikulapo now proceed within his conversation with colleagues. He proceeds that if Kalakuta means rascal, from his discovery, he concluded that if rascality is going to bring the expected result, then it is better to use it. He said that if the government understands no other language, no other words than rascality, then his own conclusion is that they should be dealt with in a rascally way. The image, which is image 3, is titled Zombie. Zombie was produced in 1978, and when Zombie was produced, it was produced to satirize the government of the day in Nigeria, and also to lampoon the tyrannical governance of military regime in Nigeria in 1977. The artist used the painting as a controversial cover to stir up nationwide hatred for military leadership. And it was popularized and common among the people, and they were singing the song all over the places and using this to castigate the government of the day. The inspiration of the album cover came after the artist has scanned through Tunde Kuboye's 1960 Nigerian independence photographic collections, which he got in Fela's apartment. And this work was produced through a paste-up of 3 photographic selections from dozens that was earlier selected by Kuboye. He edited this, and he was able to use this to represent the musical production of Fela that was released in 1978. Now, in retaliation to Zombie, then what came up after this is Sorrow, Tears, and Blood. Now, when Fela released Zombie, and Zombie was a castigation of the government of the day and lampooning the military regime that was in power. The government did not forgive Fela Anikulapo, and they were not ready to give him the freedom of speech. They were not ready to give him the freedom of association, and they decided to lay an attack on Fela Anikulapo by moving straight to his apartment and trying to retaliate for the zombie that Fela has produced. So that is what brought about Sorrow, Tears, and Blood. Sorrow, Tears, and Blood is a multi-panel painting depicting the visual imagery of Lemegarioku as he narrates the military retaliation on Fela Anikulapo on Zombie musical album released as an act of insubordination and the decision to scold the military police brutality, abuse of power, bad governance, endemic corruption, and the abnormality in governmental policies adopted as a special mode of operation through Zombie musical album he had earlier released. Now, during this period, the police, the military government sent some police and soldiers to Fela's abode. And while they got to Fela's abode, Fela requested for a search warrant before he could allow them to come in. And when they were not producing this and they were kept outside for a longer period of time, then they decided to use force to gain their entry into the abode of Fela. Getting into the abode, they torture Fela Anikulapo, they torture people within the Kalakuta Republic. They threw the mother through the window and they threw her outside, which led subsequently to her death when she was taken to the hospital. And Kalakuta Republic, as termed by Fela Anikulapo, Kalakuta Republic was set ablaze. And it was during this period that the government took over the building and they did not allow Fela Anikulapo to get back to this place. And all this contestation are the resultant effect of the consistent the consistent musical engagement of Fela Anikulapo with the operation of the government and other abnormalities that is ongoing within the public space. Now, the fifth image talks about it talks about the musical narrative of Fela Anikulapo Kuti, which the CD jacket was also handled by Leme Garioku. And in this instance, several names were mentioned in the lyrics of the Beast of No Nation. They were mentioned in Beast of No Nation. And Leme Garioku was able to resonate with the ideology of Fela Anikulapo in this illustration. And the names that were mentioned include the Ronald Reagan of the United States of America, Margaret Thatcher of the United Kingdom, Peter William Botha, who happened to be a former prime minister who upheld apartheid in South Africa. So the cover illustration is a satirical portrayal of General Buhari and Idi Agbon and other African leaders that were tagged as Beasts of No Nation. Now, Leme Garioku came up with a caption which is embedded on the CD jacket, and it reads that this uprising will bring out the beast in us. And he was using this to satirize the regime of the tyrannical leaders, that the more the people complain about, the more the people request for their right, the more the people agitate for their right, the more the people ask for fundamental human right, the more annoyed the government of the day become. And they feel that what people are voicing out as an agitation is an insubordination against the government. So the cover also illustrates the cover. The artist introduced this to lapun the government, and also it coincides with the leader who imprisoned Fela as at that particular time is now incidentally the one in power. So the 5 CD jackets that has been selected for this course points to police brutality in one way or the other in different spaces, as the governments were using police as a force to deal with the civilian. And Fela Anikulapo was not the only one that was affected in this scenario. Discussion of findings. From the study, the concept of brutality has been engaged as an attempt of retaliation and power dominance, which is used to subject the civilian into a total control by tyrannical leaders. Torture and torment also simulate as element of brutalism to deal with cases of insubordination. In most cases, the police arm used this arbitrarily without caution. It's also discovered in the course of the study that visual imagery depicts the experience of torture, molestation, ill treatment of civilians, among others, without recourse to the need to consider the right of the civilian and also to condone themselves within the society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. It seems like a lot of these discussions can sort of, sorry, I'm just going to stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
Here we go. It seems like a lot of the conversations that we can have might actually, in fact, intersect with this idea of bodily coherence and national sovereignty. So I'm very excited for the following conversation. I'm going to just partially share my screen. Let me just get there, portion of the screen. There we go. If I can get a verbal or a physical thumbs up, maybe George Life, can you? Yep, perfect, fantastic. Let me just move along so I can actually see there. I am also about to show, where is the remote control, share the chat. So I'm just putting into a chat a shared Google Drive folder in which you'll be able to follow the, you'll see my slides, accessible copy of the slides, and a accessible copy of my paper. You'll notice that I have changed slightly my paper, but I will, it's the title of my paper, but I'll explain in a little bit why that is the case. Before I begin, I wanted to start with a brief land acknowledgement because I work in Gambia, Ohio, where Kenyon College is located on the ancestral homelands of the Miami, Lenape, Wyandotte, and Shawnee peoples, among others. And the disputed Treaty of Greenville in 1795 and the forced removal of Indigenous peoples from this region allowed for the founding of the college in the early 1800s. And as a community, we must be committed to confronting this dark past while also embracing through education and outreach the many Indigenous communities that continue to thrive in Ohio and beyond. I acknowledge that. I give thanks to elders past and present, and further I acknowledge that reconciliation and social justice requires a sustained commitment, action, listening, and reflection for real meaningful change to unfold. And as we work to create a socially just and equitable world, I invite each of you participating today to learn not only about the histories and legacies of colonial violence in your own region, but to also honor truth-telling, native sovereignty, community building, and land-back initiatives wherever you are and wherever you might travel. So I've renamed my talk rather ambiguously Volcanic Poetics, Geologic Suspension in the Anthropocene, as I've considerably readjusted my thinking on the topic of volcanoes and poetry when I first proposed the abstract for this conference, and partly because of the restriction to archives in Aotearoa given the current situation, given the current pandemic situation. But by way of an introduction to my ideas about volcanic, geological, and political suspensions and networks, I do want to discuss a very curious connection between a suburb in Kettering, which is outside of Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, and White Island, which is an active volcano in the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So Quadri has been erupting sporadically since European settlement, with a continuous eruption lasting between 1975 and 2000. And for those who require visual cues, I have on the screen a picture of Quadri that was taken in December 2019, about some days after the volcanic eruption. So the volcano's sporadic eruptions have prompted intense scrutiny by the way of geologic monitoring, not only for the purpose of scientific research, but also as a matter of internal security as foreign tourists regularly visit the island. The entire island is a private scenic reserve and a designated important bird area, with tourist operators running authorized day and overnight trips into the volcanic crater. So despite seismic monitoring, Quadri's volcanic behavior is often volatile and difficult to predict, to the point where the island exceeds the abilities of the scientific community and conservation authorities to predict the strength of its activity. And case in point is the volcanic eruption on December the 9th, 2019, when the volcano underwent an unexpected and dramatic eruption during a regularly scheduled tour. The eruption rained volcanic gases, wet debris jets, and superheated air upon the unsuspecting tourists, and subsequently 21 people died, and 26 were further wounded with severe burns, and the injured quickly overwhelmed the capabilities of the national burn units, which prompted urgent calls for international aid. And this help came from an unexpected source, at least for me, the Community Tissue Services, or CTS, in Kettering, which is located 2 hours from where I live in Gambia. As it turned out, CTS is a major source for human tissue and provides products such as skin grafts and spinal implants internationally, as well as throughout the United States. In fact, if you follow their networks, they do follow the historical trade routes from Los Angeles and New York City, as well as elsewhere. And in response to the White Island eruption, CTS freighted 300 square feet of human skin to burn units in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And this transfer involved temporary allografts, or cadaver skin tissue, which are later replaced when a patient's own skin can be harvested onto their burns. So Quadri's eruption is a really remarkable graft of the international networks involved in the human tissue industry and the local environs, and indeed localized bodies. And it is important to note that these tissue grafts are big business. Market research future predicts that the global skin graft market will be worth $7.5 billion by the end of 2023. So far from responding to a human crisis, as it has been framed in both US and Aotearoa media, CTS responded to a supply and demand one, which the Quadri eruption produced. And there are a couple couple of issues here that I'll note before I'll get to the specific, the poetry aspect of this paper. And one of these is the first is the migration of cadaver tissues across borders of sovereign territories, which underscores the global networks and infrastructures that transforms medical corporations like CTS into functioning nation-state proxy actors. Secondly, as seen in the Aotearoa New Zealand memorial events that commemorated the Whakaari disaster 1 year later, catastrophes do produce new imaginary communities that are built upon citizenships of shared trauma and fragmented tissues that cut across these historical conditions of national borders and bodily coherence. And as Catherine Waldby and Robert Mitchell note, the circulation of tissues constitutes a political economy as well as certain kinds of social relations and indeed power relations. And we might say the same for volcanic phreatic eruptions that render legible acute glocal political relationships such as those created by the international tissue market. So this is a really odd introduction because the point of this paper is really not to focus on these tissue economies, although I'm certainly intrigued by their political affordances. Rather, I want to turn to the Whakaari explosion and more volcanoes more generally because of what they afford in terms of enacting the socio-political geologic relations and suspensions that we saw materialized on December the 9th, 2019. And I'm interested in hearing how volcanoes such as Whakaari have been imagined as fluvial spaces, particularly in poetry, where the interlacing ideas and networks of global realities coalesce and are suspended in both time and space. And indeed, this is going to be the point that I want to make. And by using suspension in this way, I follow Stacey Alamo's formulation that suspension is a sense that the human is held, but not held up, by invisible genealogies and a maelstrom of often imperceptible substances that disclose connections between humans and the sea. So just as a point of note here, Alamo is responding to what has been called the blue humanities, whereby the oceanic and the human are perceptibly linked by global networks such as deep sea mining or underwater telecommunications, those kinds of things. But the idea of the human environmental suspensions are also embedded in the atmospheric humanities, whose conceptual frames I do follow in this paper and indeed in my broader research. And in this context, the terrestrial and the atmospheric are enmeshed and co-constitute each other across time and space. And the volcano in particular is marked by the fact that it is not fully terrestrial. Rather, it embeds the subterrestrial, the terrestrial, and the atmospheric conditions, given that a volcano, and especially an active one, connects the interiorities of the Earth with the exteriorities of the planetary envelopment. And in fact, this is what astonished me, I think, most about the Whakaari's connection to Ohio, for volcanoes exceed our planetary geological hierarchies and networks. Whakaari's eruption was felt in Kettering, Ohio, as much as it was sensed on the skin of those who were directly injured by its ejecta. And this suspension is what I really want to sort of discuss very briefly today in the relation to poetry and specifically to Laura Moriarty's personal volcano, which enacts, I believe, the buoyancies of these socio-political relations, the public and the private, and the past and present conditions. There is a general sort of enmeshment of these particularities. And I'm just going to discuss a subsection of this book for efficiency reasons, because it is a very sort of complex collection that engages with multiple hierarchies and categories. But let me just begin with a bit of a brief background for those who aren't familiar with this book. So Personal Volcano is a 2019 collection that is part historical account of volcanoes, part documentation of global volcanic disasters. It's also an autobiography of personal narratives. It's also part critique of anthropogenic pollution, specifically fossil fuel extraction and climate change. And it's also part intertextual science fiction narrative that follows, among many other things, Jules Verne's journey to the center of the Earth. And so throughout this collection, Moriarty is very much colliding global volcanic eruptions with the eruptions of anthropogenic climate change and embodied personal traumas, which I'll explain in a bit. So in fact, Moriarty asks us very early in the collection regarding volcanic activity, is this a geological cataclysm or one of spirit of body? personal volcano amalgamates the global disaster of climate change and volcanic eruptions with what she calls the personal disaster table, that is the domestic personal traumas that one accumulates on the sort of like a kitchen table. The imaginary of the volcano in this collection serves as a metaphor for transhistorical knowledge and experiences that cut across domestic and the personal and often public disasters across time and space and across geological borders. And as a way of introduction too, personal volcano is very much in attendance of the anthropogenic conditions that fossil fuels and extraction industries enable more generally, as noted by this short passage. Refineries in the US, also of course more worldwide, where Earth becomes a sacrifice zone for pipelines and big oil, as is Standing Rock, or maybe not this time. But I want to discuss a very short section of this book where she invokes a resistance to arbitrary scales. And the case in point is this fifth section called Invisible Sun, which collects the history of natural sciences and volcanic knowledge from Greek, Roman, French, and British philosophers and alchemists such as Anaxagoras, Seneca, Plato, René Descartes, and Robert Hooke. It's worth noting that the Invisible Sun section inverts or maybe subverts the axis of geological knowledge and the modern geological categorizations of Earth's layer, or layers rather. Moriarty tells us, for example, that Anaxagoras had proposed that eruptions were caused by winds stored inside Earth. So as Moriarty, and I think she is the speaker of this poem, notes, volcanoes communicate with the molten interior of Earth and the atmosphere that envelops oxidized crust of the planet. Here we hear echoes of Timothy Choi's and Jerry Z's claims that the wind makes terrestrial things into atmospheric ones. Here they note that suspension is an opening, not a portal nor an exit that trades the ground for that above it, but are becoming open. The condition of suspension is one condition of an alien atmospheric anthropology. Indeed, Moriarty's condensed history lesson of volcanic scientific knowledges in this section of the book quickly overrules our sense of normative geological orders that reduces the Earth to standardized strata of crusts, mantles, and cores. Rather, the normative elemental arrangements of Earth, fire, and air are in fact suspended by Moriarty's condensed account of historical natural science. That this volcano suspends these boundaries between the interior and exterior underscores that volcanic formations are never complete, but a continual process of creation and destruction, or creative destruction, making and unmaking that produces landscapes and life on Earth in the first place. But that volcanoes foreground this communication between interiorities and exteriorities is only part of the equation. As I mentioned earlier, the imaginary of the volcano in this collection serves as a metaphor for transhistorical knowledges and experiences that cut across domestic, personal, and often public disasters across time and space. And perhaps a nod to the song with the same title by The Police, we might interpret the section Invisible Sun as a gesture toward how people persist despite of or because of unsurmountable tragedy, which is the point of the song and an undercurrent of this collection. Weaving autobiographical details with the history of natural sciences, Invisible Sun turns out to be an elegy for Moriarty's late husband, Jerry Estrin, who was also a poet and died in 1993 after a bout of adrenal cancer. Moriarty writes, Bronze Age eruption on Santorini or Thera, 6050 BC, where Jerry Estrin went in 1975, the winter and spring before we moved in together, and where he met a German virgin, Ulrich. They got pregnant and experienced the resulting abortion together in Germany, Munich, I believe, before he returned to me in San Francisco. I believe this was his only pregnancy. Only in dreams Jerry is about to go away or has gone or just has returned. We visit the ruins of Saint Pierre on Martinique, where the pyroclastic flow from Mount Pelée caused total devastation in 1902. Here he is, pictured among the dead. The geological inversion mentioned earlier is in full force here. For Moriarty emerges 3,000 years of volcanic activity on the Santorini caldera in the Aegean Sea that erupted in 1650 before Common Era. The explosion was so intense that it's been recorded on the Volcanic Explosivity Index of 7, which is the highest rating possible, and the eruption also released a volume of some 100 kilometers squared of ejecta and killed an estimated 70 to 80,000 people. It has been speculated that the eruption led to the collapse of the Minoan civilization and was the inspiration for Pluto's myth of Atlantis. And I also note too here that she mentions Mount Pelée, which erupted in Martinique on 1902 and lasted until about 1905, by which time 29,000 people died. So we might attend then to the stanza as merging across these time periods, and often actually very public disasters for which there is a substantial evidence. With Moriarty's very private loss. Volcanic eruptions are world-ending events, as is the loss of a spouse. Volcanoes are rather generative forces that do fragment our traditional notions of scale and loss. And so we might question then, how do we make sense of one dead among the thousands, one volcanic disaster against another in time and in space and across very different geological locations? And Moriarty actually does provide a sort of like an idea to this, or she does write, that Earth can be thought of as a single volcano scaled up. We define ourselves geologically and meteorologically, or in whatever non-human way we name this epoch or extinction or whatever this is, whoever we are. And I believe that this is the connection that Moriarty is really driving at, this resistance to measures, to loss, to extinction events and embodied knowledges. Earth is, after all, just one big volcano. And this observation leads me back to the personal losses at Quadri, which affected a lot of New Zealanders, and of course affected the industry in Kettering, Ohio. And so many of the injured were actually held and remained in suspension by the disaster's atmospheric and terrestrial conditions, where they were brought into conflict with the interior materials of the Earth, of the little Earth, and also the shared materials of public ecologies with the tissue trade. Volcanoes, as Moriarty does write, are engendered. They are worlds. They're not only as worlds, but as world conflict between deep and social ecologies, people, places, and things. And so this is the kind of conversation that I'm kind of curious about in terms of volcanic eruptions, how they do become this kind of trope, or do permit this kind of merger between plural spaces across plural times and indeed plural bodies. I want to sort of end there because I do want to sort of ensure that we have at least enough time to have a conversation with the other panelists in terms of the kinds of connections that might exist between these very wonderfully, very diverse panels. So I'm actually going to just stop there and open it up for discussion. Let me just stop my slide. Thank you very much. Sorry, that was a very brief, but I do want to sort of like open up to have a general conversation based on these kinds of papers that we actually had. And so as a starting point, before we sort of throw over to the participants, I actually want to just throw over to Dr. Quadri and George Life, whether you have any sort of questions that have been provoked by the various presentations.
Yeah, and not for now.
George.
Yeah, I'll add a question. One connection between really all of our talks was questions of catastrophe and community. So Orchid, to quote you wrote that catastrophes produced new imaginary communities. And Dr. Quadri also heard that in the artist Lamy's paintings and Falah's music and the interrelation between them. And especially like lampooning not only like national governments, the Nigerian national government, but international leaders. So Reagan, Thatcher, the South African leader, and especially what kind of transnational communities might be imagined through that, and also by trying to find ways to like erode, coherent bodies, whether that's a national body, a personal body, in terms of the sharing of skin, like what happens through police brutality, the physical violence, like what is people's response to that in terms of not just like reforming a national imaginary, for instance, like the Nigerian government, but trying to imagine some other form of community, like what happens through satire, or Orchid is just saying like tracking volcanic dissemination as geological and meteorological scattering, but also like the skin, literally like transporting skin for people to take on, so that people are literally sharing skin. So catastrophe and community, that's definitely something I've been thinking about.
I would just sort of like respond briefly to that. I think, it is something that's really interesting, I think, in the context of sort of, at least from my work in terms of the volcanic situation. I'll just sort of say that also that it's also like a very temporary community. It's not one, at least in the context, I think, of both Moriarty's work, but also in relationship to the skin tissue trade, that the tissues that were sort of like applied to the human body are actually, it's a lot more contested than that, because they are like cadaver skins. They're not meant to stay on the body. So there is this sort of like this tension between where bodily coherence is and the limits of that in the context of, at least in the tissue trade. And if we can just apply that to, say, Moriarty's collection, there is that sort of sense of also the communities themselves are themselves temporary and contested, particularly in relationship to disasters. They are world building, they are sort of like world making and world dismantling events, but the trauma itself is sort of even more muddy. It's not something that is fully defined, and I guess that's the nature of trauma, is that it doesn't lack, the boundaries are not they're not defined.
Okay. With respect to the question that you asked about satire, that what is in the mind of the people, or maybe what they have in mind for coming up with satire. Now, ordinarily, the masses are not interested in causing the breakdown of order within the society. And if you look into it, you see that most of these agitations, they focus on the expectation of the people within the community, either the expectation from the government or the expectation of survival within the community. And they look into a situation whereby how can we get our voice? How can we get the message to the government? How can we get our agitation to the government? And there are diverse ways or diverse tools that can be used in getting that across. And one of it is dialogue. Dialoguing or getting across to the governmental representative to let them know what the masses are passing through. But when all these agitation are placed before the government of the day, it seems that the agitation are just mirage or something that is not important. And for instance, the youth now look into it, that what is the first means by which the message can get across to the government, or the first means by which the right things can be done in the space where it is expected. Now, when we're talking about activism or protest, it is not about, focused on bringing down the state apparatus or stopping the orders within the society. It's also create attention for the government to be able to look into the agitation of the people and to also hearken to the voice of the people. And it is tagged a non-violence, but in a situation where either the government or the people that are concerned are not understanding the voice of the people, then they misunderstand what people are doing or the attempt that people are pushing forward, and then now they react in the negative. But at the actual sense, in collaboration or in tandem with the fundamental human rights, I should be able to voice out my pains. I should be able to say what is within my heart or whatever I'm passing through, because when we are in a democratic society. But when you are not, you are in democratic society in quotes, but you are not operating democracy, that is when you will now be raising eyebrow against the agitation or the requisition of people from the government, and you see it as an act of insubordination. So satirizing it is a situation whereby you try to what? Bring out the fact in a subtle way, such that the government will still get the message, but when they look into it critically, they cannot be, they can't come out and say that this message is directly being passed across to them. And that is why in satire, different elements are used. The elements that are closely related in forms of metaphor, or you see it as a parody, or you see it as any other literary form that can be used to present the message of the people. So in coming out with satire, it's not a situation whereby they want to pull down the government of the day, or they want to point out the critical negativity of the government, but the interest is that let the government do the right thing that they need to do part time, then the society can be in order.